Hello, hello, hello.
Policy at PIDE. I know it's Saturday morning. It would be difficult for all of you to come and wake up early, but it's not without any advantage. We can learn about economic issues of ours and talk about it, so it's not all bad. Yesterday evening, the first chapter of what we call a conversation on Pakistan's development priorities was full of fervor and enthusiasm, and we can see the energy levels are still very much up. Today we have lineup of 4 sessions, starting with achieving fiscal sustainability, and followed by transforming the role of private sector, and third will be unleashing the agri-food sector, and fourth one and the last one will be achieving energy sector sustainability. But don't worry, we have tea breaks and a lunch break as well. So I'll introduce the first panel for the first session, which is achieving fiscal sustainability. We have Syed Ali Hasnain, Associate Professor, Economics, LUMS. Irshad Hussain Saab, former Governor, State Bank. Sobia Khurram, Professor, University of Punjab. Noman Ishtiaq, Senior Expert, Public Finance. Ehtisham Ahmed, he is the Professor, Grantham Research Institute, London School of Economics. And our moderator will be Matthew Verghese, Regional Director for South Asia Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions, the World Bank. Over to you, Matthew. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction, and welcome to you all to this session on achieving fiscal sustainability. Ehtisham Ahmed, unfortunately, was not able to join us. So the reason you're not seeing him here is he can't join us. He was hoping to connect virtually, but unfortunately that hasn't been possible as well. But we're fortunate to have a wonderful panel. Actually, it's really nice to see. Now, as only appropriate in our part of the world, we're going to start with a movie, sadly without song and dance, but hopefully will set us up for the session.
Pakistan is a country that struggles to sustainably meet its public spending needs. Its expenditures exceed its capacity to generate revenue, which means the government has to borrow from different sources to cover this gap. These loans come at a steep cost. While they help cover short-term needs, repayment of these mounting loans adds to the country's already outsized expenditures. These expenditures are often of poor quality, paying for subsidies and administrative costs rather than supporting growth and services. This has a disastrous impact on Pakistan's ability to improve the welfare of its citizens. Pakistan has also struggled to generate revenue. Its tax generation capacity has stayed largely unchanged over the past decade. The overall tax system imposes an unequal burden. The system relies heavily on general sales tax on goods and services and custom duties. Meanwhile, collections are undermined by very large tax exemptions. Large parts of the economy, including the agriculture and real estate sectors, remain largely untaxed, which could be important sources of revenue for the government. The tax system is complex with overlapping rules and rates, making things more complicated for individuals and businesses, leading to high costs for those following the rules. State-owned enterprises contribute to the problem. These companies are becoming a liability, costing money instead of making it, and their financial situation is getting worse.
Fiscal deficits and the fiscal position of the government really are an underpinning problem that manifests in so many of the economic problems facing the country. High inflation, high debt, underinvestment, all of this has its roots in an unsustainable fiscal deficit. Whereas what a government ideally would be doing is providing public goods and providing infrastructure that enables private sector activity and enables economic growth. What we've had too much of is a government that is borrowing, taking resources from the banking sector and using it to fuel consumption and administrative costs. That leads to very low rates of investment, and it leads to very unsustainable macroeconomic indicators, and it undercuts the potential for faster economic growth in future. The key reform priorities are to tightly focus expenditure on what can support sustainable economic development. That means reducing expenditure on subsidies, it means reducing expenditure on running costs, it means increasing spending on human capital and increasing spending on the bases for productive economic development. We also need to think about revenue. We need to move away from a system where a very narrow proportion of the population ends up paying comparatively high taxes to a system where everybody pays their fair share. That will mean moving away from heavy reliance on indirect taxes like the sales tax towards new revenue bases, including taxation on property and agriculture, and making sure that some of the exemptions that are currently being provided to those who are very wealthy are narrowed or removed.
टैक्स की तो बात ही ना करें, हर चीज़ पर गवर्नमेंट ने टैक्स लगा दिए। सारे टैक्स क्या हम गरीब आवाम के लिए? बड़े बड़े ज़मींदार, बिजनेसमैन, पॉलिटिशियन, इन्हें कोई टैक्स नहीं। और क्यों दें यहाँ टैक्स? क्या मिलता है हमें टैक्स देकर?
Pakistan's revenue is about 12% of GDP, and expenditure is about 19% of GDP. And this fundamental gap drives a lot of the challenges in Pakistan. It contributes to inflation, the need for imports, and the general ability to invest appropriately. Interestingly, the expenditures are not that high by middle-income country standards. 19% of GDP is well below India's and is within the range for developing country standards. The revenues are low. So if you were to look at it from the perspective of how Pakistan's public finances compares to other countries, the first takeaway for me is that the expenditures are actually not high, it's their quality, but the revenues are low, and that will need to change. So there is a need to both lower expenditures because of the immediate challenges, and also raise revenue. But the real benefits to Pakistan from changing the structure of its finances, of its public finances, will come from having a quality of expenditures and revenues that reflect the priorities and policies that people want. And this can be consistent with different levels of expenditure and revenue. In the US, they tend to prefer lower levels of public services and lower levels of taxes. Now, if you're willing to do both, to live with lower levels of public services, then you can also live with lower levels of taxes. What you cannot do is want lots of public services and low taxes. That's a much harder combination to sustain. It also reflects choices about how services are delivered and who delivers them. And those are also choices that countries make. So in the medium term, the discussion of expenditures and revenues is also a discussion about the choices that a society makes, and it's also about ensuring the quality, the basic quality, the management of expenditures and revenues. And today, we'd like to discuss both the short term, which is the immediate need to actually close the deficit, at least partially, and in the medium term, what kind of expenditures and revenues would Pakistan want to see over time that is consistent with a growing, dynamic, prosperous society. So, with that easy challenge for our distinguished panel, maybe we can start with the short term and with expenditures. Now, the purpose of this panel is to have a discussion, which is why it's configured like this. We're seated around a table, and we're going to have a free-flowing discussion. My understanding of my main job is to interrupt if somebody either goes on for too long or is veering too far off topic. But short of that, we're free to speak. This will go on for about 40 minutes among us, and then we'll open it up so that we can get a good discussion going with all of you. That worked well yesterday, so I'm looking forward to that as well. So with that, we'll have a free-flowing discussion, but maybe I can start with you, Sobia. So if you're thinking about the short term and if you were the finance minister, where would you start?
Thank you, Matthew. Very happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to engage today with all the participants for this session and beyond. You just said that what choices does the society has to make, and I was just thinking, I'll start first from the government's standpoint. At the moment, inflation is at a record high in Pakistan. And in the morning when I was preparing for the session, I was just thinking, there are a lot of households who are finding it really, really hard to make their monthly budgets. So just think of a household, and I'll just start with an example, that they have a total income of 100,000 rupees. Now 70%, if that house or home is Pakistan, 70% of that earned income goes to your debts. So then you are left with 30% of the income. If that is the scenario, if that is the bleak scenario, then how would you design your expenditures? You're not going to spend those expenses on buying more vehicles. You're not going to spend those expenses on, building a new house. So if we talk about Pakistan, and 100% of the amount we collect every year, 70% of that goes towards your debt servicing. So you're left with 30%. So when I think about that, we have to go into a super austerity drive. I know there are a lot of people who are going to probably disagree with me, but just think about that from a personal standpoint. If I have a house and I have to make a budget, and out of the 100%, I'm left with just 30%, I would be spending most of that on education, right? Health, food items, all the necessities. So yes, there is an argument that why are we not maybe pursuing, an overall hiring ban? Why are we've recently increased the travel and fuel allowances. Why are we not very critically reviewing the PSDP projects? We have to do that. The projects which have already been funded, and they are maybe in the first 2 years, and they've not started, maybe we can close them. We can't afford that. And it's, the situation is not very positive at the moment. So I'll just start with that, and I'm hoping more panelists can start, can add on to my point. Yeah.
Please, so from here on, just jump in as you see.
Yeah.
Matthew, we have to unpack the fiscal situation. There has been too much attention on the federal side of the fiscal equation. But the elephant in the room is actually the provincial finances. And I'm afraid neither the World Bank nor our researchers have analyzed what is happening to the provincial taxes and provincial expenditure. And let me, as I believe in evidence-based analysis, let me give you some numbers. This is a comparison between 2009 and 10, when they got the NFC award, which is 60%, including grants going to the provinces, and 40% being retained out of the divisible tax pool by the federal government. And the idea, which is quite still, to me, very persuasive, that because all the basic public goods and services are at the local level, education up to high school, health facilities, drinking water, sewage, solid waste disposal, mass transit, everything, you empower both legally as well as financially the local governments in order to provide these services. And therefore, a larger portion of this 60%, which is going to the provinces, will go to serve the ordinary citizens, which have much better access to their local governments as compared to their MPAs and the ministers or the MNAs. And this is empirically proven. And in my book, Governing the Ungovernable, there is a whole chapter which produces the results of the surveys which were carried out during 2001 and 2008 and 9 when the local governments did function. So that didn't happen. The provincial governments have actually consolidated. And I give you the example of Karachi. Karachi had Karachi Development Authority, Mali Development Authority, Karachi Water Sewerage Board, Karachi Building Control Authority. Where are they? They are now Sindh Building Control Authority, the Sindh Water and Sewerage Board, the Sindh Solid Waste Disposal. So what has happened? They have consolidated. I just give you as an illustration. Numbers speak for themselves. What have they done for education, health, drinking water, nutrition? The expectation was that when you give this money to the provinces, the allocation to education and health has remained static at 35, 39% range. And the outcomes have gone worse. There is no increase in literacy rate in Pakistan. The net enrollment rates are stagnating. And the quality indicators, as the World Bank's own discussion note shows, there is an increase in what they call as learning poverty because of quality. So you have the money, you have not used it in order to improve the quality of education, health, or access even. The access has not improved.
Is there an opportunity to actually reduce expenditures in this mismatch?
Well, that will come as a local government. A $1 in the hands of the local government has a productivity of 1.5, and $1 in the hands of the provincial government has a productivity of 0.75. So you have twice as much kick if you give it to the provincial, from the provincial government to the local governments, because they know their local problems and they are more cost effective in utilizing that. They know where the primary school is required and where the primary school is not required. I confess, as an arrogant civil servant, as the chairman of the Provincial Development Working Party in Sindh, I used to approve 500 schools, not knowing whether there's a need for the schools or not, there are teachers required or not, and I used to do this. And that is a stupid thing to do. But the local governments know where they need and how much they are going to spend. And I tell you, they may be illiterate, but they are quite visible in their decision-making, which is more rational. So what has happened to this money? From 1.8 million employees, today they have 2.3 million employees in the provincial governments, while the federal government has remained at 928,000 to 981,000. The wage bill of the provincial employees has gone up from 340 billion to 1540 billion, a multiple of 4.2. The average wage in the provinces has gone up from 189,000 to 670,000, 3.6 times. Federal government, 89 billion was the wage bill, and now it has gone to 260 billion, which is only 2.8. Average wage, 96,000 to 265,000 at 2.8. 40% of expenditures are incurred by the provinces, but their contribution to revenues is only 10%, 1% of GDP. And they are sitting at agriculture income tax, which is 22% of the value added. They are sitting at the property tax in the urban areas. They are sitting on the services taxes, and they are sitting on the real estate, which they are not. So 60% of your national economy is outside the tax net, because that is the responsibility. So I just want to give you a picture which is not available anywhere, but which is the real picture. And the federal government is paying the interest payments, they are paying the PSTP projects for the provinces, they are paying the BIS social net transfers to the provinces, and the provinces are just not doing anything in order to help themselves.
Thank you very much, Ishan. So there's potentially also, because there's excess, they've hired a lot of people at the provincial level, potentially there are some savings to be had by reducing expenditures at the provincial level, some of which can be passed on to the local, and then some of it can contribute to the savings, if it's politically possible.
That's right, if it is politically possible. I would like
By the way, I should say, for these discussions, everything is on the table.
Sure.
So we shouldn't rule anything out.
Yeah. So I would like to respond to the earlier question that you had. Do we need to reduce government expenditure? And if we do, where exactly? I tend to agree with your initial number that you've given. Government of Pakistan does spend about 19% of its GDP in total, federal government, provincial government, and whatever the amount goes to the local governments. If we take out the interest expenditure from there, as referred earlier, it's about 12%. And if we compare ourselves with low-income developing countries, take out this interest, they are spending about 17%, sub-Saharan African countries about 15%. I think overall, the government's expenditure without interest is actually quite low. But having said that, there are a large amount of arrears in the system that haven't been paid, for example, based on the numbers that we quoted for this year, 2023, i.e. 2022-23. So if we include those arrears that need to be paid, then perhaps the expenditure, the total expenditure goes up. Now, at this moment in time, we are spending 2 times more on interest than health and education, and maybe also income support combined. So the interest expenditure has increased considerably, while there has been some degree of increase in health and education expenditure, predominantly on the salaries. I tend to agree that the quality of expenditure on health and education has not been that good. So our overall ranking in HDI is probably the same as it was in 2005 and now 2022-23. If we take out the total government expenditure, take out defense, interest, the government claims that about 70% goes towards pro-poor expenditure based on Pakistan Poverty Reduction Strategy paper. So what does that tell me? That tells me that there needs to be some sort of reallocation of resources from maybe those priorities which are not delivering to higher priorities which need to deliver. So hence the question of reallocation of resources towards better productive outcomes. In terms of equity, I think one key issue in our expenditures has been that it hasn't been that equitable. We have issues related to income inequalities, gender inequalities, and also territorial inequalities. On the equity side, let me quote you the number from Sindh. Now, the secondary education survival rate in girls from poor families in Sindh is less than 1%. So of the total number of girls who are enrolled in schools in Sindh, only 1% survive in the secondary education. So I tend to actually agree with what Dr. Saab has just said. The outcomes are actually not commensurate to the expenditures that the government entails. The stunting rates, for example, have remained almost the same in the past two decades. Now, the question is, what type of government do we want? Do we want a central government which is quite big, a centrist government, or do we want a decentralized government? And I think that's the main question. If we look at, for example, the federal government, I'll talk about federal government specifically, we've got about 40 ministries. We've got about 85 principal accounting officers. Now, these principal accounting officers are secretary level, grade 22 mostly. We all know what is the size of the cabinet. We also know that about 400 attached departments or autonomous organizations. And the pension liabilities of most of these organizations are now skyrocketing. Do you know last year, for example, the federal government paid 7 billion rupees to Radio Pakistan for its pension liabilities? Do you know last year for railways, the federal government paid 55 billion rupees just for pensions? So these mounting pension and also arrears are causing huge amount of drain. I think if given a choice, maybe being a finance minister, I like to undertake root and branch reforms. I don't think there are going to be some aspirins that are going to solve our problems. We need surgery. We need surgery on the tech side, expenditure side, NFC side, but also looking at accountability side, accountability for results. And I can maybe continue to talk about some of the specifics where expenditure can be cut, but I'll maybe request other colleagues to talk about it. Thank you.
I want to disagree with Numan. If you look at the policy notes of the World Bank, which we have been distributed, the expenditures are not pro-poor. There is the deciles of each income group, and this is tilted towards the higher income groups. And you look at the same policy note on tax side, and it shows our tax structure is regressive, where the poor are paying much higher tax incidence as compared to the rich. So I just wanted to correct the 70% pro-poor. I just don't accept. Look at the policy notes of the World Bank, which have been circulated.
Absolutely, I tend to agree. This is the number that I've quoted from Ministry of Finance.
Well, I don't.
This is what they consider being pro-poor, and hence I've challenged this number by talking about equity specifically, but I can talk about equity further as well.
So I think one of the things that we're reaching to is perhaps that the amount of spending that's happening in total in some is not very high. In fact, if you look at sort of micro level data on where we're spending money and how much we're spending money, in Punjab, I've been working on police reforms, research on police reforms in partnership with multiple other countries, and we spend 1,000 rupees per investigation of a case of a crime. We have 1/3 the police force per capita of Indian Punjab. We have about 1 public clinic for every 10 villages in Punjab. And these are numbers, and you can pick your area and you'll find similar, which does sort of align with this conclusion that you're drawing, Ishaq Saab, that we are not being pro-poor in our spending. But the conclusion can't be drawn that we need to lower spending, I don't think, which is where we started from. I think we need to focus more on thinking of how to generate more revenues, but fundamentally, of the revenues that we do mobilize, we have to ensure more sustainable spending of that money. We're doing some incredibly unsustainable things, such as taking loans from private banks to run the country, right? The country economic memorandum that the bank put out last year had a very nice depiction of where Pakistan stands in terms of how much money we borrow from banks relative to our finances. And they were an extreme outlier relative to other countries. And so what we're doing is we're saying, we don't have enough money to run the government right now. Instead of going and raising taxes, let us borrow money and then add on interest liabilities and let future generations worry about paying those taxes. And that's insane. There's no other word for it. It's not insane, actually, it's evil. And so perhaps we need to start from, in this conversation, is to say that Pakistan fundamentally works beautifully. Political decline, economic decline in Pakistan is functional for a certain group of us. There was a very nice figure in this note that was the discussion note 6 that was circulated right at the end, which is what you were talking about. where we're showing that we're actually taxing the rich relatively less than we're taxing the poorest, right? And so there's a long tradition of, in the social sciences, people actually articulating exactly how developing countries work well for elite. And this is quite sustainable. We've had a fiscal deficit for, give or take, every year since 72. We've had a trade deficit for, give or take, every year since 72. Every government of every form has run trade and fiscal deficits, and the power elite haven't been challenged in their power. And there's no reason why this can't last as long as they can find the next loan. I promise you, if we find the next loan from somewhere, the next $10 billion or $20 billion, $30 billion, whatever we need, we'll all go back to our rooms, our houses, we'll sit down and we'll say, Pakistan works beautifully. And so the question, and this is where I'd like to also perhaps put this to the bank and the PIDE and whoever is sort of people who engage on these sort of initiatives. What's our theory of change? Right? So if you look at the British tradition of how bureaucrats provide information, the idea is that you advise and then the politician decides. And that works great in accountable systems that are acknowledged to be accountable. Pakistan is acknowledged not to be accountable. That's why we're here. So what's our theory of change? Why are we doing this exercise? Is something that, I think it's a good thing that we're doing it because we need the evidence base, and unfortunately there aren't local institutions doing enough of this work. But let's also talk about our theory of change here.
Yeah, just a small comment adding on to Ishrat Saab's point. The pro-poor policies, just think about that. The Benazir Income Support Program or the Hisas program, we give them few thousand rupees every month. And we're not talking yet about taxes, but our tax mixture is that 70% of our taxes are indirect. So on one hand, we are giving them few thousand rupees, and on the other hand, we are taking them away in the form of indirect taxes, and that's not fair, that's not equitable, and there's no growth in that.
We'll come to taxes in a minute, but I just wanted to respond to you, Ali. In some ways, so the way I see it, Pakistan's development model over the last, decade, 2 decades, possibly even longer, has in fact been an unsustainable macro position that gets band-aids in the form of these loans or transfers, and we are part of that. The World Bank has also been lending to Pakistan. The one problem with that is that it doesn't lead to real development. It allows the status quo to continue. But the larger problem now is that I suspect it's going to become less and less sustainable because that money is just not going to be enough because it's spiraling out of control. Your interest payments are growing so that they'll keep growing. The private sector will get more squeezed. And so that choice is not there that's my sense. Not that something is going to happen tomorrow or day after, but over a reasonable period of time, something has to change. And it can change in a bad way, or it can change in a way that you've seen in other countries that have reformed. And what that brings about, what the theory of change is, I don't know, but it has to come from within. It has to come from within Pakistan. You started us off on revenues, so I want to go to that. Unless, Noman, you wanted to come back on some specifics on expenditures. You mentioned that you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, maybe what we also need to do is put public investments on the table as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Last year, the government spent 2.3% of its GDP on public investments, what is normally called development expenditure. Now that translates into 1.9 trillion rupees. That's quite a good amount of money. And I think the question about how do we improve the productivity of the public investments should be put on the table. At the federal government, we have 1,200 projects that are funded by the PSDP, Public Sector Development Program. I think what we need to do now is probably, as said earlier, reduce the number of projects and maybe allow federal government to only focus on nationally important projects, strategic projects only. We also provide a considerable amount of money going to the parliamentarians for the local level schemes. Maybe that needs to be reviewed as well. We also see that from global studies, IMF has suggested that about 40 to 45% of the total money that is spent in low middle income countries in development expenditure goes towards waste, and a considerable amount of money goes towards corruption. So I think maybe that's another area that we need to discuss on how do we improve the productivity of the PSDP. Secondly, on the subsidy side, now we all know that there are large subsidies that are being paid on the energy side, commodities, and maybe other sectors as well. For example, to Gilgit-Baltistan in the budget, there is a 10 billion rupee subsidy on wheat. Is that targeted? Does that go to everybody in Gilgit-Baltistan? Those are the questions that perhaps we need to ask. In FATA, ex-FATA, 14 billion rupees of arrears on the electricity side are going to be paid towards through the budget this year. So maybe we need to ask the questions around that as well. But these are difficult questions. A large number of these amounts are actually arrears. So we need to, one, discuss what do we do about arrears, and also what do we do about the policy going forward about a number of these things. And I can maybe go on, but the total number of workforce, as Dr. Saab said, the government employees, federal government, it's a large government, maybe we need to look at that. Maybe we need to reduce the number of ministries. There are about 40 ministries. Do we need these many ministries in the federal government? Also, the regulatory burden that these ministries create, maybe we need to review that as well. And also, in many cases, the land holding by the government. If you go around Islamabad, you will see that there are housing societies for the employees of a number of these government ministries and government organizations. And there is access to specific land by the government employees as well. That needs to be put on table as well. So, a host of these things. Just one last comment. In many countries, especially high-income countries, there is a process called spending review. It's part of a strategic budgeting process that needs to undertake the question on efficiency, equity, and also productivity, and to decide whether these expenditures are actually needed and whether they provide impetus to economic growth, and also building climate resilience, on which I can talk separately maybe. But I'll stop here. Thank you.
Matthew, before you move to taxation, I don't want to speak out of turn, but are we still talking about expenditures, or are we moving to taxation now? Well, because if we are, all right. I know Sophie hasn't spoken, so we have to think about how we want to increase the efficiency of expenditures. I was this morning reading something about China's state-owned enterprises, and this was a lamentation of how China has too much of a government. And the evidence was that the returns on investments in the private sector in China is about 28%, and it's about 18% for the public sector. And I was thinking, I would take 18% from PIA. I take 18% from Pakistan Railways and from all of the other array of 4G fertilizer and whatever else that we have. So then we have to think, well, we are very fond of the China model without articulating what the China model is. And so one thing that I like to do is think about, well, what did China do? And one thing that they were very good at doing with their state-owned enterprises is that they broke those enterprises down into competing entities. And so if you're going to build a new railway track, China Railway Group A will compete with China Railway Group B. And these are self-contained firms where the profit-loss motive is the disciplining factor. And there is serious competition between state-owned enterprises. There's no reason why we can't think of, so the conversation in Pakistan on privatization or the state-owned enterprises is this sort of on-off switch of whether we're going to keep them in the public sector or move them to the private sector. There's now great evidence that there's a third way of going about it. The essence, I think, of markets is that you need competition. And if I may, in Urdu for one sentence, जो word root है मुकाबले और काबिलियत का वो एक ही है, right? So जहाँ मुकाबला होगा वहाँ काबिलियत होगी. Where you have competition, you will have excellence. There are ways for us to think of. So perhaps I mean one of the lessons I think of how society changes. There's no one path. You experiment and you find your way. But perhaps one path for us to explore is, instead of saying you're out of a job, and that's a political cost we're not willing to bear, how are ways to think we're going to make you work as efficiently as the private sector, you're going to face the consequences that the private sector faces, and maybe that can be a halfway solution.
I agree with you totally what you said about China, but you forgot to mention that 56% of the total expenditure is the central government and 44% is that of the local governments. And the competition is coming from the local governments. One local government is competing with others. And India has now adopted that model, which is called the fiscal federalism, where Gujarat chief minister is going after the international investors and the local investors to come and locate there. And you look at Uttar Pradesh and you look at Gujarat, there's a huge difference in poverty, in incomes, because these dynamic states in the south and the west are actually competing with each other to improve there. So I think you have to realize that our SOE triage report, which we prepared 3 years ago, says these are the SOEs which have to be retained by the government, but their productivity, their rates of return have to be improved through restructuring. Everybody is agreed that anything which is a state-owned enterprise is not bad. You have to distinguish between those which are really providing essential public goods, which the private sector cannot provide. So there is a distinction of 85 SOEs, each one of us classified in one category or the other. So please do not think that we want to privatize everything.
Yeah, small comment for state-owned. I think we do have a list of state-owned enterprises, and they are categorized into, these are the ones to be retained, these are the ones which maybe can be privatized, and the ones which can be, the third one was liquidated, right? I think the interim government has recently recruited a minister for privatization, and I'm just hoping that they're listening to the conversation happening at the moment. We keep talking about that, and we keep listening about this, that, you know, so many state-owned enterprises in Pakistan are of no use, and then there are probably 3 different ways in which we can go forward, but nothing is happening.
In addition to the studies that Ali has just talked about, maybe we also need to look at our domestic research. I mean, PIDE does huge amount of work. They have identified a number of areas where waste can be reduced, and also, you know, maybe looking at a monetization of state lands in order to maybe reduce some expenditure, increase the revenues. So there are, just to add to what Ali has just said, there's considerable amount of domestic research that we also need to see on these issues of reduction of expenditure.
Now we are really moving to revenues, since you, since you took us there already. Do you want to keep going on what some of these measures might be on the revenue side?
Maybe what we can do is talk about specific things, and I'll come, because you've asked me a very big umbrella question.
No, but specific things, yes.
Are you talking about tax, or are you talking about other revenues, non-tax revenues? Taxation?
So Pakistan needs to raise revenues. Whether they come from tax or non-tax, that's fine. But so you can choose. Okay.
All right. So I was just reading the World Bank note in the morning, and I was just thinking through all the points which are right. Yes, the exemptions, good tax policy is good tax administration. So all the arbitrary exemptions need to go, right? We need to reduce the compliance cost. One of the ways of doing that is through the digitization of the tax system. We already have that to some extent. We have the tax e-filing system. We have a tax Asan app also. But I keep asking this question. I'm doing some research on that also. These two initiatives, have they actually done any real digitization as far as the taxpayers' compliance cost is concerned? I don't know how many people who are sitting here who file their taxes. By the way, that is also a minority. But out of that minority, how many people file their taxes themselves? If you have to hire a tax consultant, or if you have to have a tax lawyer and pay, whatever money you have to pay to file your taxes, that means that digitization, that transformation of the tax systems where the tax the tax collectors are at arm's length from the taxpayer is not working. And probably that is something we need to look at. And I will use the C word here. I was just going through the World Bank paper, and I was just, all right, what about the opportunities? What about the current ongoing opportunities for corruption which are there? We are not talking about that. There is a huge amount of money which is lost to the opportunities of corruption which are there for the tax collectors. If we are not going to go for prosecutions, if we are not going to go for penalization, that is simply not going to improve. And there is a lot of political economy in the background of that. But I just found out that there was not a lot of discussion about this point in terms of corruption. I mean, the motivations and we can categorize that, but from the opportunity side, there is a lot of international literature which says that we have to, we have to remove the physical contact between the taxpayer and the tax collector. Fine. How can we do that? All right. We can do that through the digital mediums. Has it happened? No. Most of us use, I give an example of banking apps. It's a commercial enterprise, and they want us to, do most of our online banking ourselves so that they don't have to do that in their brick and mortar setups, right? Those banking apps are easy. You've learned that. You do most of your banking there. You pay your utility bills, whatever transfers you need to make. Why can't we pay our taxes with that ease? That is my question.
Actually, sorry. I was just wondering if it's possible to do a poll. I'm asking the organizers, in this audience, how many people file their taxes electronically, and how many people use a tax consultant? So if we can just do a quick poll on that.
Maybe we can have a show of hand in the moment.
Digital, we have to be digital. We can do a show.
So I've been teaching a class on the economics of corruption for a decade now, and I've reached the conclusion that we shouldn't care about corruption. We shouldn't care. China.
You're not telling your students this.
No, I do. I absolutely do, because the goal is to not give them a lesson in morality, which they absolutely should do. And I'm not saying corruption is a good thing, but as an economist interested in development, I look at India, which is incredibly corrupt, and I look at China, which is incredibly corrupt, and I look at 19th and 20th century America, which was incredibly corrupt, and I reach the conclusion that we have to think of things beyond corruption. We have to expand the topics that we concern ourselves with. And corruption, there's the Imran Khan sort of corruption, which is this big word, this jihad against this big word, right, of corruption. And then there's corruption at a granular level where you're saying, okay, driving license office has corruption because of these reasons, and passport office has corruption because of these other reasons, and the forestry department corruption can be explained in other reasons, with other ways. And there's been no conversation about those specifics, despite a decade of us talking about corruption at the highest political levels, and many decades of drawing room talks about how corruption is the worst thing in Pakistan, which I agree it is. But the solution is not anti-corruption. The solution is to reorient the incentive structure. Ishad Saab, I didn't forget about the municipality thing. The thing is that my conclusion that corruption is not important is in part because of reading Yun Yun Ang, who has this fantastic book. She has two fantastic books on China, one of which is China's Gilded Age. And the biggest lesson that I drew from that was precisely this, that in the 1980s or 70s, when China was facing a financial crisis as bad as ours today, it was poorer than Pakistan. They devolved the collection of taxes, but also the expenditure of taxes down to below what is in Pakistan the tehsil level. And as you said rightly, at that time, the subnational collection of taxes in China was about 80%, which is exactly the opposite of the situation that we have. And the important thing there is not only being better at collecting taxes. Committees that meet in Pakistan on taxation are called revenue mobilization committees. When economists start studying taxation, it is not to mobilize revenue, it is to think of how to fix externalities. There are other functions of taxes that we are completely oblivious to in the functioning of this government. If you want to think of how to extract more resources in ways that are better for the economy, you have to think of how to align the incentives of the tax collector with the community from which they're drawing taxes. And then the conclusion that so for those of you who are not familiar with that work, what China did was that they paused the transfer of funds from the federal government to the provincial government and said, khud kamao, khud khao type thing for the tehsils. And then they said, money that you collect at the tehsil level, the bureaucracy within the tehsil has control over and can take some of it home. So in a time when China was economically very poor by any measure, the bureaucracy's income level started rising, and then they exceeded private payoffs. But fundamentally, what it meant was that there was then competition, as Ishad Saab correctly pointed to. There was competition between, so think of Gujranwala competing with Sialkot, exactly the way Sir said. When you have that competition, your delivery of public services by the bureaucrats to business leaders is improved, and then the rest is history. So it's not just we should go and collect taxes here. We have to think what will the implication of that be for the economy.
Your question. 3 years ago, we had a lot of complaints by the exporters that the refunds, which their own money, which they have paid to the government, are stuck for years altogether. So the FBR created an end-to-end solution where you upload your claims along with the supporting documents, and then algorithm goes through those documents, and anything which is accepted according to the criteria which are predefined, they are approved. And through IBN number of your account, they are transferred to your bank account. And in 1 year, 2021, FBR refunded 250 billion rupees without a single complaint about transparency, corruption. Even the checks which were being picked up from the FBR had a cost. You have to pay 3% out of that in order to pick up your check even. For processing, the FBR officials asked for their own money. All that disappeared. Now, this has to be not only continued, but extended to all taxes. And that was the plan. I don't know what happened. I left in 2021, so I don't know what happened. But there are solutions which you are suggesting where there will be no interaction between the taxpayer and the taxpayer. And I give you the example of our reforms which we did in 2002 to 2005. Self-assessment. You do the report yourself as to how your tax liability is. The tax collector has no authority. Out of that, 10% are randomly selected for audit. So 90% people are insulated. So the tax collection went up from 300 billion to 1,000 billion. So these are examples in Pakistan where transparency, lack of corruption can actually yield results for the betterment of the taxes. So that was the answer I wanted to give.
I think that's an excellent point, but then I keep thinking about if we have these success stories or pockets of reforms which are working, why do we stop them? I mean, we should think about that. I mean, if we have these little instances where it worked and we saw, improved tax collection, isn't it those rent seekers, gaining control again because we've not find a way to stop them?
If you don't have continuity of the policies and every 18 months or 2 years you have a new government coming in and they start with their own agenda and say, throw away what the previous government did. You had 25 years, 12 prime ministers. They are only surviving for their own good. They are not going to continue what was happening. That is the reason why
I would also,
Extra Saab, how do we get continuity? The question is, how do we get continuity then?
Yeah.
So can I,
Where do we get continuity from? It's an important
Very
question,
small-
right? So then what do you think? Where does continuity come from? Why don't we have continuity?
I would also add here that you said about prime ministers and my PhD thesis, which by the way was finished in 2016, and the title was A Way Towards Pakistan Revenue Authority. I recommended reforming FBR. And when I did my case study on FBR, I was able to find that the average period for every chairman FBR was around 3 months.
That's right.
Yes. So how can they make changes? Yeah.
okay, I'm going to,
Same is the case for finance secretaries, and especially look at the finance secretary tenure in provinces. You'll be surprised.
look, we're going to have to wrap this up because we want to bring a broader, have a broader discussion. But I did want to ask one question. So this last discussion raises this, raises in some ways, the fundamental issue. It's not that Pakistanis don't know what needs to be done, right? We know what needs to be done. Pakistanis know what needs to be done. The question is how to get it done. So let me, in this discussion, the point that sort of came away for me was in various ways the fiscal federalism, the relationship between the center, the state, and the provinces and the local governments is a big avenue for change. For example, the point that you pointed to, or the getting competition between the SOEs. So the question that I want to close our discussion is, if we were going to make progress on this issue, on fiscal federalism, how would you go about it practically? So abstracting from the question of, well, they will never do it, whoever they are. But if you, Ishrat Saab, if you, a not completely unlikely scenario, if you became a finance minister, what would you do? How would you go about it? And you were given the authority.
Now, I can tell you, Matthew, that the problem is, as you pointed out, is not we don't know. Most of the people sitting in the room know what needs to be done. It is the implementation of those beautiful papers, strategies, plans, which have been prepared all over the place by the ministries, by the donors, by the think tanks, by PIDE. Everybody knows what needs to be done. It is the political economy which really is the critical point. And the critical point is predictability, consistency, and continuity of the policies. Now, the whole local government apparatus was thrown away by a newly elected government which came to power in 2008. So if you throw away without fixing what the difficulties or the problems were, you have to start all over again. And then the new government comes in and throws away what the previous government had done, and economic reforms do not coincide with electoral cycles. The Indian reforms did not make an impact till Vajpayee from the BJP became the prime minister in 1996, and then they continued. And the Indian investors and the foreign investors said, the license Raj is dead now, irrespective of the fact which government comes to power, we will continue to have our rates of return. Here, if every government has new policies and new paradigms, how can an investor be assured that the investment he or she is making today will have the desired yield? So consistency, continuity, and predictability. And Constitution provides it. Constitution says 5 years is the tenure of a government. And in the 5 years, they can take tough decisions in first or 2 years and tell the people through communication, which was your point yesterday, that look, you have to bear the pain. But in 4 or 5 years, when you're going for the elections, you say, look, you bore the pain, but now the economy is improving. We don't have to go to the IMF. We don't have to go to the external creditors. Give us another time, another 5 years, we will further improve your living standards. That's a viable political economy. But if I am the prime minister and I'm only trying to keep my chair warm because I don't know when I'm going to be thrown out, either one way or the other, I will not take those unpopular, tough decisions because I'm insecure. So the insecurity is the driving force for not taking these tough decisions.
Thank you. Anybody else wants to come in on the implementability of some of these proposals?
Perhaps in addition to political issues that Dr. Saab has just highlighted, maybe we can also put on the table the capability and capacity of the civil service to deliver. In countries where there may be less continuity of the prime ministers, probably we need to see whether it's the civil service that actually maintains that momentum towards policy. And I think policy-making capability in civil service and its implementation capability should also be put on the table in addition to these political instabilities.
But you know yourself, Noman said, the finance secretary have been transferred 3 months. She said FBR. It is because the politicians want their own loyalists rather than the people who are competent to carry out. And you remain in the Ministry of Finance. So it is linked with the political economy. It is not a civil service capability. You know that even the officers from the OMG who are not from the Pakistan Administrative Service, who have remained section officer, deputy secretary, joint secretary in the Ministry of Finance, are more capable than the parachuting officers who are very competent, who come there for 1 year or 2 years. You know that, you have worked there. So it is not an exogenous factor. The capability of the civil service is an endogenous factor, dependent on who is in the government. It's called permanent civil service, but every time a new government comes in, they bring in their own people as finance secretary, as FPR chairman, as secretary. That is not really a viable solution.
Thank you. So if you all agree, can we open the floor up now and for questions? Kulsum, where are you? I wanted to, there you are. So Kulsum had agreed to start us off with a focus on service delivery and the link to public finances.
Thank you. Thank you, firstly, for an excellent, transparent discussion. I was thinking about Ali's point about the theory of change and his example of China. Actually, Shah Mehmed, who couldn't be here, his work actually in China and in Mexico and in a number of other countries does shed light on that. And I guess the punchline is that you design your whole revenue and expenditure system linked with some sort of sustainable economic growth strategy. If you look at it that way, then, for example, that puts a completely different spin in terms of provision of public services at the local level, the importance of that, the importance of having a skilled, healthy workforce, and that whole stunting discussion last night, which was actually about loss of productivity at a national level. So given, if one were to look at it that way, for example, in Pakistan and say, let's do it focused on sustainable economic growth, and then you get down to, at least for me, it's stunting and it's private sector-led growth. Those two things come up. What if you approach it that way, what does it mean in terms of revenues and expenditures? How you rationalize your current expenditures, keeping them at that same level, but also raise revenues so people can see what they're getting. And actually, to Ishrat's point about continuity, actually having data and indicators, the only group that can actually ensure continuity in any country are its citizens. If they are clear about what they want from their government, and they can only understand fully what they are getting, I mean, they know it at a local level, but if the data is out there and information is available, that's how they're going to know. And they are the ones who can ensure it, nobody else. I'd love to hear from the panel on this, particularly specifics linked with a sustainable economic growth strategy and linking the fiscal system to that. Thank you.
Regarding Ishrat Hussain's comments for the bureaucracy, I think they're not competent. We must accept this. They're not subject specialists. So this is time for subject specialists on the key positions. A person who has done his Bachelor of Arts, how he can be a secretary or ACS or chief secretary of the province. They are just trained for that. It's a process. They are getting the training through MCMC and SMC. While we have plenty of experts who had their PhDs, they're just sitting in the university's boundary. I think we should change the induction policy, that we should bring the MS and the PhD people, and maybe in 10 or 20 years, you will get the results, first of all. Secondly, your political lead is not capable. We are not bringing true people to the assemblies. They don't know. They don't know finance. How can they bring a good solution for the society? They have damaged us, our whole society. They are responsible for this. Not from now, from many decades. Secondly, your Prime Minister. The gentleman talked about corruption. So I agree with him. We should leave that aspect. We should concentrate our development plans. Municipalities must be strong. They should make their 100 years plan with a complete. We have experts for that. In Pakistan, we have experts for it. We can take support from the World Bank, from other organizations. So they should have a 100 years plan, what to be done in this 100 or 50 years. So I think, and this is the way that England is doing and other countries are doing. We have easily available models. We have to just cut and paste, but we are not doing. Now we are sitting in Islamabad. You can go to Balochistan. You can see the life over there, on the borders, the people. You can go even in Punjab and see the life over there. So this shows what we are delivering to the people. We are not sincere to our nation. We are not working. We are just talking, honestly speaking. We have models. Even in your tenure, you had models for that, but nothing implemented. Every government who comes, they sit, they just talk. We have all these sessions, we just talk, but we don't think what we are doing, what we have done. So it is, I just commented that we have played criminally. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum, this side. At this side, thank you so much for putting light on a lot of important aspects of physical sustainability. And I want to ask basically the whole panel that you people did highlighted the aspect of government spending and a lot of things, but there was no light shed on the topic that where is the budget going on, the rest of the budget. There are institutions that own a lot of organizations running without paying taxes. You people didn't put any light on that. I would like you people to put light on that. And what about the taxation of those organizations owned by an institution that are running? And then another aspect that if not privatization, then why not public-private partnerships? Why not public-private partnership? Because SOEs, they're sucking out a lot of physical budget of the country as a whole and not even providing sustainable services. So why not public-private partnership? This is one of the aspect that I want you people to put light, and the other aspect that I'm sorry, very disappointed that you people did not put any light on the defense aspect, that they're taking the budget and they own a lot of enterprises, but they do not pay taxes. So if not privatization of those institutions, but at least taxation for that institution, the organizations they are running. So thank you so much.
So, can I say I would definitely like to hear from the panel on these questions?
Last one. Let me correct you on what your assumption is. All enterprises of Fauji Foundation, Shaheen Foundation, Army Welfare Trust, and Barrier Foundation are paying taxes. Fauji Foundation is one of the highest taxpayers in Pakistan. This is record, and you can verify that. As far as defense expenditure is concerned, it is only 18% of the total expenditure. And you have a situation where both your western borders and eastern borders are insecure, and your internal security itself is being threatened every day. What is the correct level of expenditure? Nobody knows. What are the security threat perceptions? We cannot really evaluate that in a quantifiable manner. Where we have to draw the line is that there is no preference given to any foundation like the FWO or NLC as far as the contracting of the public tenders are concerned. There, I agree with you that there should be a level playing field where there should be no preferences. Let the private sector also compete with the FWO NLC. Their argument is that we have lost thousands of our workers creating the KK Karakoram Highway because nobody else could do this. This will be very difficult. We are creating the highways in Balochistan. No private sector wants to go there. That is their argument. But still, they have to pay taxes, and they have to have a level playing field. This is what the popular perception is, what you rightly pointed out, but the facts are otherwise. As far as the control of there is concerned, it's only 4 to 5% of the total stock market capitalization. All their companies are listed on the stock market, and it's 4 to 5%. So I just wanted you to be aware of the facts rather than the rhetoric which goes on. So this is the answer. You're absolutely right on the public-private partnership, but this is happening, but in bits and pieces. I live in Karachi, and Sindh government has engaged the TCF for partnership in schools. So these are government schools, but they are being run by TCF. They have brought in Indus Hospital and ISIUT, which are one of the finest institutions, to manage their hospitals in the rural areas. So this is happening. Is it enough? Not, it is not enough. Now coming to your problem, which you rightly pointed out. See, the secretary is a synthesizer who brings in different dimensions of perspectives to take a decision. You have to have the engineering or technical perception, you have to have a finance, you have to HR, and most of the subject matter specialists are very narrow as far as the decision making is concerned. If I'm an engineer, I very much like an engineering design to dictate the outcome. While the finance people would say, this particular solution is elegant from engineering point of view, but it is not financially viable. So the generalist brings in a synthesis of the different competing point of view and gives a decision. That is why you need. In the federal government today, sir, there are only 6,000 generalists, but 26,000 agriculture scientists, IT specialists, economists, and subject matter specialists. They are all advising the government in their own fields. For example, the Agriculture Research Institution is advising on agriculture research. So their inputs are taken. But somebody has to look at the bigger picture, an integrated picture, and a holistic picture in order to look at the financial dimension, economic dimensions, and the technical dimensions, and that's why you need. But I agree with you, if there are smart engineers who have this broad vision, they should be made the secretary. So the proposal which I made after 19th grade, it should be open to everyone. It should not be the monopoly of any one particular service. And degrees, sir, do not count. In the State Bank, I got a CV from a gentleman who was complaining that he has not been promoted. And he has all the degrees and all the diplomas and all the training courses. And I asked for his performance report. He worked in 3 departments, and he got negative reports of performance from 3 departments. So I'm a great believer, not in academic credentials, but on performance of the job. And that should determine whether you are fit to go up or go down. So that's my answer to your question.
Ishrat, thank you. Just a reminder to the panel, our natural instinct is to look to the crowd, but you have to speak to the mic because we also have an online...
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Gentleman was very persuasive, so I wanted to...
Yes. No. And that's my instinct as well.
Do you want to respond, or do you want to collect more questions? Because I have something to say on defense.
Please.
I'll try to be a little brave about this. Civilians comprise 99.75% of Pakistan in population. So even if in the stock market we have 95% of the share, that is an underrepresentation. But more importantly, we have this sort of tension where on the one side, as Ishra Saab has pointed to with KKH, there is this claimed lack of capacity on the private sector side. I don't know the counterfactual way they had said to the private sector, go and build KKH, what would have happened? Because in the private sector, for example, miners lose their lives all the time doing their work. Other sailors have lost their lives in history in the private sector. So this is a weak argument to my mind. But what happens then is that, so why do we have defense housing authorities in Pakistan at all? And why do we all want plots there? To my mind, there are 2 reasons. One is Pakistan lacks good property rights outside of DHS. So if I'm going to buy a file in this clown society, I'm going to lose my money. I have lost. My mother bought a plot for me when I was 18. I still don't have ownership of that plot. It's in a large and well-known housing society that started in Pindi. So if we had those property rights, then I would not buy a file in DHA because I'm paying a premium for DHA. For that 1 canal plot that I'm getting, I can get a cheaper plot outside. I'll get perfectly good municipal services within that housing society. But I'm worried about my file. And so once you do that, now the incentive structure is such that the previous army chief is claimed to be on record by Shabaz Zaidi live on national TV saying, we don't want you to raise property taxes because we have people coming and saying don't raise property taxes. And that is, if you read history, why would you consider anything else to be the case? They have a veto, a de facto veto on power, and they will serve not just the interests of the nation, but their own interest. And that's sort of, we should not expect anything else. The problem for me is that they're not strong enough to rule over Pakistan throughout histories, and there are times when they leave power. But then there's also interference, and there's recorded history, and these are the Azhar Khan case said, beyond this point, there will be no wing of the intelligence services working on politics internally. The previous army chief is on record saying, we didn't follow the constitution. And yet they get state burials. So, and this is, I mean, you read history and this is what happens everywhere. And so the question for me is not this sort of, this really narrow conversation, wo sare paise le gaye, ye whatever. The question is, how do we work together to build a Pakistan where we go from existing power elite? I think Stefan Durkon is supposed to be here somewhere, right? I love the cover of his book and the contents also, but the cover, because the lottery is being played by one of the hands holding the what's it called? The lottery machine is a military hand, wearing fatigues. London is full of African generals who've got plots and cars, supercars and all of that, right? Armies tend to be politically powerful. But then if you want to survive and if you want to flourish, there has to be a conversation where within the military there is this realization that Pakistan is not working for us. And if you keep carving out monopoly powers, this Special Investment Facilitation Council says that, and these army farms and so on, where in the world in history have soldiers run farms? And so this is going to harm them. It's not just for us. It's not just for 99.75%, it's also for them, because Pakistan is getting weaker. And so the conversation that has to happen at some point is that we say, let's sit down and preserve some of your interests, but let's think of a way where we can get the rule of law in this country, because that's the thing that we haven't talked about. I hope that's brave enough.
You know, when we started, I said, I hope we can have a frank conversation where nothing is off the table. And so thank you, and thank you, Isha. I mean, I think these are exactly the kind of conversations that need to happen so that you can
Take one more question.
Get to a different place. Yeah, we'll take a, do we have time? Is somebody going to signal to me when we're really running out of time?
Maybe just last comment.
No.
Okay, this is about, Dr. Ishrat mentioned implementation of policies, and very rightly so. The question that policies are not being implemented. So the question is, why not policies are being implemented? Has anybody looked into this? What are the issues and challenges? Is it because people or officers as head of the different institutions such as Federal Board of Revenue, Ministry of Finance, they change frequently? Maybe so.
Yeah, sure.
But in my understanding, I think we need to look at the documents, the policies, the strategies themselves. Look at their targets. Are those achievable? Are those realistic? Are those data-driven? Are those evidence-based? If not, then perhaps we need to revisit those strategies and documents. And then the question that nobody looks into, the question as to why those have not been implemented and what should change if there is something which has not been implemented. And finally, I've seen, this is out of my own experience in the development sector, that different ministries or institutions and departments, they work in silos. There is no coordination. So how would you implement a national strategic document when Ministry of Commerce is preparing its own document, Ministry of Industry is preparing a separate industrial policy in silos, whereas Ministry of Planning is developing a growth document or a strategy, and all working in silos without talking to each other. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
So the first question is, does the political patronage system linked to the civil service distort incentives for good policy making and implementation? The second one we have is from Abdul Mian. He says, are the solutions to reducing government spending really as simple as they sound? If they are, why haven't they yet been implemented? So I think that follows up exactly from the question we just had from the floor. And finally, Dr. Ishrat said that devolution to local governments is needed. What's preventing devolution? Unless that elephant is addressed, these conversations are futile.
Ishrat, do you want to go? Your line.
Yeah, devolution is not taking place because there is a conflict of interest between the provincial legislators who are going to lose their clout and their importance once the district nazims or the mayors or the metropolitan corporation heads assume the power of providing all the basic services. Today, the MPAs and MNAs have their own development funds, which they spend in their constituencies. Those funds should go to the local governments, and the local governments should decide as to where they are going to be spent because they are accountable to the people who have elected them. The mayor of Lahore, if he is given the water supply, the sewerage, the land authority on education and health, will have, and he's elected directly by the people of Lahore, he would have a very big clout, and he can challenge the chief minister that you cannot interfere in the service delivery. So you are actually creating forces of competition between the provincial government and the local governments. And the local governments are not being empowered because the provincial governments and the provincial legislators, and I've sat in the conversations with the Prime Minister and the Cabinet where the chief ministers have said, after this law is approved, we will have nothing to do. So my answer to them was, resign from being an MP and MNA, become mayor, become the district Nazim, and you will have the clout. If you want really power, that is the way to go about it.
I've been asked to close the session, so I'm going to give each of you a final word if you want it, and then we'll close. I saw a lot of hands. No, I'm sorry. I'm apologizing, not allowing any more.
Yeah, just a small comment to Ishrat Saab. Ishrat Saab has been obviously rightly propagating local government reforms. When we read about some of the ongoing reforms in Pakistan and other developing countries, and I think I'll add to that gentleman's point also, we have a lot of research studies which are already available internationally. And for local solutions, I think PIDE is doing a wonderful job. Those studies and their results are already available and we can use them. So by just referring to them, power can be devolved to the local level. I'll just quote an interesting study by Nepal here. They had this problem of corruption when they were issuing driving licenses, that the instructors would take money and and they wouldn't do the test correctly, and obviously they issue the licenses. So what they did was that they had one police person tagged with every driving instructor, the one who was taking test. And what it ended up, power was shared, and both started taking money, speed money, right? So in Pakistan, if we devolve power to the local government, what we hear is why the existing civil servants would not want power to be devolved. Why the MPAs would not want power to be taken away from them, because that power would go somewhere else, and then that would be the rent-seeking opportunities for them. So we have to understand. I think I'm going to repeat myself when I say that yes, I agree with, I understand when you were making that point about the anti-corruption reforms and the morality discussion regarding corruption. But the pilferage or the leakage because of corruption is so huge that any reforms which are thinking of doing, it emerges as one of the biggest hurdle, and we have to think about that. Yeah.
I disagree, because I think that, as I said earlier, there is corruption around the world. You mentioned driving licenses. There's a famous corruption paper on driving licenses in India, where they show that 35% of licenses that are being issued, the people are randomly getting failed, so that induces them to go to the agent outside, ke uske through aaye. That's not the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is that in any country with 250 million people, there are lots of different power centers, ecosystems, and the collective of the power elite. I spoke about the military, but also the business elite. The business elite of this country would like nothing better than for us to have a cheap dollar. They don't know how to get it, but there isn't this shift to realizing that we need to move away from import substitution, that a cheap dollar is not sustainable, and then to actually to come to admire devaluation. The reason that we don't admire devaluation is that we resist it until it becomes untenable to not devalue, and then there's a lot of uncertainty and turmoil in the economy at the time devaluation happens. If you did it gently and regularly in a planned fashion, we need to reorient towards exports. But in some sense, we are a group of advisors, all of us in this room perhaps, are advisors as professors, as local institution people, or the World Bank, whoever else. We are advisors who are sitting here polishing our advice in the hope that someone will now listen when no one has listened for 75 years. What we need to do, and I don't mean this in a defeatist way. I think what we need to do is, if you look at the Pakistan at 100 report the bank did 3-4 years ago I was involved with, or the country economic memorandum, or as others have said, we have these reports going back, then we have to think of the increment to the knowledge base that we now have to make, to our theory of change, and say, here are the political constraints, and then to come up with these political bargains. Again, going back to Durkheim's book, I really buy into this idea of having to create this consensus in enough of the power elite that we want to think of making ourselves better. The year I was born, Pakistan was richer than India, richer than China. Right? The year I started studying economics, 1 Pakistani rupee could buy 1.5 Indian rupees, or thereabouts. And yet, while our biggest ally and our biggest adversary have learned how to grow, we haven't absorbed lessons. And so we have to create these spaces within society, and PIDE is doing a great job. Nadeem Saab isn't listening, but he's done a great job. Others, but there aren't enough places where we're having this conversation, and this conversation can't just be in Marriott and Serena. It has to be at the Tandoor Wala, in their language. And they have to be brought information in possible ways on TikTok or wherever else, so that the conversation, because another thing that happens when these sort of political movements change is that there comes about some sense of a solidarity. So China was easy to reform to some degree, because it was a state that solved the problem of what it means to be the Chinese nation centuries ago. They had a functional bureaucracy and all of that. India was a relatively easier place to solve, because they had good bureaucratic institutions that they had inherited from the British, and they solved the problem of democracy during the challenge to the British Raj. Pakistan, there's a nice book by Maya Tudor, who's now at Oxford, where she argues that the independence movement, the Pakistan, or the Muslim part of the independence movement, was really sort of grafting into new lands these people, but without having the institutions in place. And there's inertia to those institutions. We have to start from scratch and think of how to create a nation. And it's a messy place. So whether we'll have enough of the power elite come together and come to a consensus on a charter of economy, which I'm going to celebrate in a few weeks. The first time I heard the term charter of economy a decade ago, I still haven't seen this charter of economy. There is deep debate, or rather lack of consensus, not debate, but lack of consensus about such fundamental things as who needs to be taxed, whether the dollar should be expensive or cheap. And so we need to figure out spaces where we can have those conversations. But I'm resigned to the fact, if you read history, it's quite likely that I'm living in 11th century Spain or France. And my job is only to help create the increment so we reach the 12th or 13th century and there's enlightenment and all of that, and we'll see. I'll stop.
Thank you. So if we go back to the main topic of the discussion here, I think the budget deficit is the bane of the economy. It's a central problem that needs to be addressed. And for that, I think domesticating policy, domesticating research is perhaps one important point that I would like to put on the table. Policy making has been, in many cases, outsourced to us consultants funded by you donors. And in many cases, those policies don't work. They're not owned, and they're not going to deliver. We need to now think about new model of policy making. Policy making within civil service is the future, including organizations such as PIDE, research organizations, has to be domesticated. We cannot cut, copy, and paste what China did or what France is doing or what Spain is doing. It's not going to work for us. We can learn from them, but we need to domesticate our policy. And I think I take Ali's point forward. We need a reform agenda. What is the reform agenda? What are we going to do? What are our priorities? We need to discuss that and build consensus around that. Perhaps that can be a beginning for a debate towards reduction of budget deficit, which I think is the central problem that we need to address as soon as possible.
We're way over time, so we're going to have to close this now. Now, if I were rating us as a panel, I would say that we didn't do very well on the short-term suggestions on how we address our immediate challenges. But what I found really enthralling was the discussion of some of the more fundamental shifts that are needed within the economy, which is really, that's the big one. Those are the changes that are going to make a difference and put Pakistan on a different trajectory. Whether it's thinking about fiscal federalism differently, whether it's thinking about the role of the state-owned enterprises and competition within provinces, between companies, thinking about the role of the non-standard institutions, shall we say, including defense. These are all fundamental questions that indeed have to be answered domestically, right? These are choices that societies have to make, and you either make them consciously or it sort of drifts along, and often drifts along in ways that don't serve the country well after a while. And as Naji said yesterday, this is the time to decide. I mean, I think I actually don't think you have the luxury of waiting 6 centuries, 8 centuries to reach thing. It has to happen. And the good news is it has been turned around. Changes, societies that have been in some ways in worse situations than Pakistan today were able to turn things around. And but it has to come from within. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. A big thanks to the panel. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for insightful session, digging deeper into the issues and extracting the solutions. We will now have tea break for 15 minutes only. Please grab tea and coffee and come back again for the next session. Tea break for only 15 minutes. Grab your teas and coffees and come back here inside the hall. Thank you.
Super, thank you. Very good.
Good session.
Yeah.
You know why I'm here?
Oh, no.
Yes.